Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. As you guys know, we're in the coronavirus shutdown, so I'm doing these videos for my students. All of these videos are intended for the students taking my A&P class, the way that I teach it, the way that I test on it, and what I know that they need to know for their fundamental understanding of the anatomy and physiology of the body for their progression through their health science programs. I actually worked in the medical field for a while, so I've both been a researcher and taught at a university, and I've worked in the medical field, and now I'm teaching at a community college because that's the audience that I really enjoy and love so much. So anyway, that's who the intended audience for these videos are. If anyone else there in YouTube land finds these by accident and learns from them, great. These are simple, fundamental, rudimentary, introductory videos to show an understanding of the basic principles of anatomy and physiology to prepare you. If you don't set the foundation well, the whole house comes crumbling down. I know some instructors go into all this incredible minutia and detail, and you memorize all this stuff, but you don't know why. I want y'all to have the foundation, and then all the details will fall in place as we go on. So, also, before I get too far into this video, listen, I've gotten a number of emails and some feedback from my students, mostly in great appreciation for the videos. The videos are not the quality that I would like. There's lots of me doing the ums and ahs and rubbing my nose and my dog barking, and I have to let him out. But we're stuck in a difficult situation, and I don't have the time to make these slick and pretty. Ultimately, what I want to get across to you guys is not about me, but I really, really appreciate the fact that you guys are hanging in there and hanging tough and working hard under these difficult circumstances. I know many of y'all are worried about paying the bills, significant others not working, not in town, stuck in the oil fields, can't come home or whatnot. Now you have children at home, they're running around, you're trying to make sure they get their education, that they maintain their sanity. You're working through whatever issues you got, keeping their assignments going so that they can finish their school year. In addition to things like death and illnesses and other things that people are dealing with. So I truly appreciate all the hard work, the dedication, and the effort that each of you is putting forth. I always brag to everybody that I have the best students in the world, and I really believe I do. Okay, and being a great student doesn't necessarily mean you make 95s on everything. What it means is you have hard work and dedication and the strong desire to succeed, to drive through the difficult issues. All students face issues. I think very often at the community college, the issues that we face are slightly different than many university students. Not all, but many. So just know, guys, that I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate the kind words and the feedback that you're giving me. And we're just trying to finish this together as strongly and as successfully as we possibly can to prepare you for the next level of your education and your career. So thanks for the hard work. Thanks for sticking to this. And if you have any constructive criticism, fire it at me. I have plenty of my own for myself. I've watched a few of my videos. But hey, they are what they are for now. All right, so this lecture is for my Human A&P 1 course, 2401. We're in the last lecture test 6, or the quizzes that would be the equivalent of lecture test 6. As y'all know, since the shutdown, we're not doing big lecture tests. We're doing several smaller quizzes that equal a lecture test. We're doing the nervous system. We're doing the spinal cord videos. Excuse me. So we're on lecture video number 3 in this last test, but it's number 2 on the spinal cord. Okay, the last one I went over the tables on page 81 and 82 of what the anatomy of the spinal cord is and what those structures, what you find where in the spinal cord. Now we're actually going to see how the rami, the ventral ramus, the dorsal ramus, the rami communicantes, what roles they play, and how information flows into the spinal cord and out of the spinal cord, okay? So bear with me for a second. I'm going to draw a quick and crude spinal cord, and we're going to go over this stuff. So we went over this anatomy last time. We have the posterior median sulcus. We have the dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, and then that's going to fuse with the ventral root here. They form a spinal nerve. And then very shortly, that spinal nerve is going to branch. There's a dorsal ramus, there's a ventral ramus, and coming off of the ventral ramus, there's a pair of branches that split and then come back together. And we're going to draw something that's part of our thoracolumbar region for a reason here. but nonetheless. So this would be called the rami communicantes, the autonomic ganglion, and the autonomic nerve. Okay? The opposite side of the spinal cord would have the exact same setup. Our spinal cord exhibits what's called bilateral symmetry, and that bilateral symmetry simply means both sides are symmetrical or look the same. It's a fancy word for saying both sides are the same. Bilateral symmetry. So, we know we have the central canal here, we have the gray matter. As you guys should know, the posterior gray horn has both the somatic motor and somatic sensory nuclei. So I'm just going to put that in here like this. And I'll make them different colors for a reason. But here we have the somatic sensory nucleus in green. And we have a little bit deeper, we have the visceral sensory nucleus. So all visceral sensations are going to come in and end there. They're both in the posterior gray horn. The lateral gray horn, we said we had the visceral motor nucleus. That's going to be important in a little bit. And in the anterior gray horn, I'm sorry, I put visceral motor. That's visceral sensory. No, it's visceral motor. My bad. Visceral motor. And then we have somatic motor. Sorry, all these abbreviations are getting in my head. This would be our somatic motor nucleus. Okay, we did all that anatomy in the last video. Now, the reason that becomes important is because we want to follow a sensory pathway into the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the bottom of page 82. The dorsal ramus is going to receive all sensory input from the posterior wall of the body, or the back of your body. So if I'm going to have a somatic or a visceral sensation come in from the posterior wall, so sensations from the posterior wall, they're going to come in through the dorsal ramus, through the spinal nerve, course through the dorsal root. The soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and if it is a somatic sensation, meaning from the skin, it's going to go there. If it's a visceral sensation, then the neuron would come in through the dorsal ramus, through the spinal nerve, then through the dorsal root. The soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and it would synapse in the visceral sensory nucleus. And then, of course, from there, the next neuron would take it up to your brain. So, the dorsal ramus receives all sensations, both somatic and visceral sensations, from the back. They come in through the dorsal ramus, then through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root. The soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion. They synapse in the somatic sensory or visceral sensory nucleus, both of which are in the posterior gray horn. Now, what if I was going to come from the ventral wall? Or actually, I'm just going to say from the front, sides, and limbs. Okay? That means from the anterior or ventral wall of the body, the lateral wall of the body, or our limbs, arms or legs. Any sensations coming from your hand, if you stuck your hand on the hot stove, or if someone poked you in the side or in the belly with a needle, that would be a somatic sensation. Those somatic sensations are going to come from the front, sides, and limbs, and they're going to enter the ventral ramus. Ventral for front, dorsal for back. Duh. But this also includes the front, sides, and limbs. That sensation is going to come through the spinal nerve. I'm not going to draw it all in a whole new axon all the way through, but the neuron, well, I will. The neuron lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and the sensory axon comes through the dorsal root, and it would synapse over in the somatic sensory nucleus. Got it? Now, if I have a visceral sensation, let's say I have an infected sweat gland in my skin, well, that would be front, sides, and limbs. That visceral sensation would come in through the same pathway, through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, through the ventral ramus, through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root, and it would also synapse in the visceral sensory nucleus, so to speak. Okay, so we know that the dorsal ramus receives all sensory information from the posterior wall of the body. The ventral ramus receives all sensory input, both somatic and visceral, from the front, sides, and limbs. Now, what if I have a sensation from the ventral body cavity viscera? that's going to come in through a different pathway. Okay. Now, the autonomic nervous system is controlling and monitoring the viscera, and it's adjusting smooth and cardiac muscle to meet the needs of somatic muscle, right? We did all that sympathetic, parasympathetic stuff. So now, what if I have a visceral sensation from the ventral body cavity? So I'm going to do this in blue since it's visceral. So I'm going to do it on this side of the spinal cord just because I've already got so much going on over here that I don't want to make it too messy. So if I have a visceral sensation from the ventral body cavity, and again, these are broad generalizations. There are going to be exceptions to the rules in some areas where it's different than this, but I'm trying to give you a basic understanding of what's happening in all these structures. This axon is going to come in through an autonomic nerve. Now, when it comes to the two rami communicantes, one of the rami contains myelinated axons, and because it contains myelinated axons, let's say it's this one on this side, then we'll call that one the white ramus, because it has white matter in it. This other one would be called the gray ramus. And by convention, most textbooks draw the white ramus closer to the spinal cord, the gray ramus further away. Our textbook doesn't, but that's okay. They're flip-flopped in the textbook. Well, one way to tell is if the incoming sensory neuron, the axon coming from your viscera, comes in through the autonomic nerve, well, anytime something's giving us sensation from the viscera, that's important. We're going to have myelinated axons. So that's going to come in through the white ramus of the rami communicantes, then through the spinal nerve, then through the dorsal root. The soma will live in the dorsal root ganglion, and they'll synapse in the visceral sensory nucleus. Now, all of this is written in bold on page 82 and 83. If you read the dorsal ramus, it tells you sensory information from the skin, muscles, and viscera of the back enter here. Ventral ramus, visceral and somatic sensations from the skin, muscle, and everything from the front, sides, and limbs comes in here. And when it comes to the visceral sensory pathways, it says all neurons from viscera, thoracic, and abdominal pelvic cavities will pass through an autonomic. It says never in the note set because autocorrect must have fixed it whenever I sent the files to be printed. But it should say autonomic nerve, then through the white ramus of the rami communicantes, then through the spinal nerve, the dorsal root. Soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and they synapse in the posterior great horn. And I have these pictures drawn in your note set for you so that you can just write them and draw them and practice them. Okay? So, you guys should know this. What is monitored by the ventral ramus? What is monitored by the dorsal ramus? And what sensations come in through the autonomic nerve and the white ramus of the rami communicantes? Got it? So I'll ask questions like, a visceral sensation from the guts of the ventral body cavity would come into the spinal cord through which of the following structures? Okay? And you can figure out how I write my questions and all of that. All right, so now we know those pathways. Now I'm going to do, there's a reason there's several of these blank ones in your note set, because we're going to draw several pathways, okay? I got a bunch of these blank ones, so every time you finish one, just do another one, okay? So I'm going to erase some of this, and I'm really going to erase this side and then just redraw it, okay? On this side now, I'm going to do some motor pathways. I just want to erase all this stuff right here. I will redraw it so that we can follow some motor pathways out of the spinal cord. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the somatic motor pathways first. They're pretty easy. You can tell I've done this 1,000 times. Like I said before, I had when we did this stuff when I was a student in neurobiology at the senior level, I'd already done the anatomy and physiology, but then when you go through other courses, you go over this stuff again and again. You finally really learn it. I had to learn this in my neurobiology class, and I had a professor. Everyone said, don't take this guy. He's super hard. So obviously I took him. I always like the harder professors. One of the best professors I ever had. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. I was fortunate enough to have communicated with him a few times. But then tragically, I found out recently that he passed away. And I don't know from what. I believe he had cancer. But anyway, Dr. Denny, if you're listening, man, you were awesome. So, motor pathways. Well, if I'm going to do a somatic motor pathway, meaning I'm going to control skeletal muscle of my body. Somatic motor means always skeletal muscle. The somatic motor pathways are pretty easy because there's one neuron from the spinal cord that goes all the way out to the muscles. So even if I'm just going to wiggle my fingers, there's a super long axon going all the way out without stopping from the spinal cord to those muscles. The longest axons in the human body go from the sacral region of your spinal cord to your toes without stopping. Pretty amazing that they have these long axons. So the soma of these neurons is going to live here in the somatic motor nucleus in the anterior gray horn. They will send their axons out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve, and then it's going to go one of two ways. If it's going to go to muscles of the back, and I mean skeletal muscles since we're talking about somatic, it's going to go straight out the dorsal ramus. If it's going to go to skeletal muscle of the front, sides, and limbs, I'm not writing very neatly here, but that's front, sides, and limbs, then it's, instead of going this direction, it's going to come out the ventral ramus. That would obviously be two totally separate neurons, but you get the idea, okay? So I can have a neuron going here. If it's going to go to the skeletal muscle on the back, if I'm standing here and I want to look up at the ceiling or I want to bend backwards like you're doing the 1-2 way backs in school or something, that nerve starts in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord where the somatic motor nucleus is. It's going to send its axon out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve. If it's going to go to the back, it goes out the dorsal ramus. If it's going to go to the front, sides, and limbs, it would follow the same pathway, but go out the ventral ramus to the muscles of the limbs, the front of the body, or the sides of the body. Got it? So somatic motor pathways are pretty straightforward. This is where it's going to get a little bit crazy. And that's when we do visceral motor pathways, because there's sympathetic and there's parasympathetic. So now, let me erase all of this on this side, and I'm just going to ignore that stuff. I don't really care about it right now. But I want to follow some pathways going out to the viscera. So this would be our dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, and then we have our rami communicantes here. So now, when I talk about autonomic innervation, autonomic means sympathetic or parasympathetic. When we are stressed, fight or flight, we get really sweaty. You get nervous, your palms get sweaty. All these things start happening at the surface of the body. When we get under parasympathetic control, we don't sweat so much. Under sympathetic innervation, we can dilate some of the blood vessels to our skin because all that activity is going to generate excess body heat. To dissipate the heat, since fluid like blood carries heat very well, we dilate the blood vessels to the skin, and that blood will flow here, transfer to sweat glands, and we sweat. So under sympathetic activation, we're going to activate sweat glands. Sweat glands are viscera. We're also going to affect some of the blood vessels in our skin and dilate that smooth muscle. Okay, so now, if I'm going to go to viscera, two meaning motor, if I'm going to go to the viscera of the back, the posterior body wall, one of the things that happens is this. Okay, let me give you the setup here. From our spinal cord, if I'm going to go somatic motor, one of the things you'll notice is there's one neuron that goes all the way out to skeletal muscle. Man, my penmanship's terrible today. So, and we also know the neurotransmitter released at a neuromuscular junction. That neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine, capital A, capital C, little h, right? Now, if I'm going to go to visceral muscle, if I get a different black marker. See how this one writes. That's okay. I'll get another one in a little bit. So if I'm going to go to visceral muscle, meaning smooth muscle of the posterior body wall, or anytime I'm going to visceral muscle, for the most part, I'm going to have 2 neurons before I get to the smooth muscle. If I'm going to affect smooth or cardiac muscle, what happens is there's a nerve that comes out of your spinal cord, out of the lateral great horn, since that's the visceral motor nucleus. It's going to stop somewhere along the way and synapse on another group of neurons here. Anytime I have a group of neurons, somata, outside the cell body, we call it a ganglion. So this is going to be called an autonomic ganglion. The second neuron will go and synapse on the effector, on the smooth or the cardiac muscle. Turns out that we always use acetylcholine here, and very often, if we're talking especially about sympathetic, we're going to use adrenaline or norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter here. Okay, so we usually have 2 neurons going from the spinal cord to the effector in the autonomic motor pathways. So autonomic motor pathways are a little bit trickier because we always have to go to an autonomic ganglion. Well, guess what? That's what this is. So since this is my autonomic ganglion, before I go out the back of the body, I have to stop here. And it turns out that the preganglionic neuron, we're going to call this one here the preganglionic neuron because it's before the ganglion. And after we leave the ganglion, this is going to be our postganglionic axon. So the postganglionic axon is usually unmyelinated. Usually. The preganglionic axon is usually myelinated. What that means is, when I leave the visceral motor nucleus, my preganglionic neuron is going to come from the lateral gray horn, out the ventral root, because the ventral root's always motor, out the spinal nerve, but it has to pass through the white ramus of the rami communicantes. Remember, this one's white, this one's gray. Okay? And then it stops at the autonomic ganglion. It's kind of a crazy way to get there, but it does this. Then it synapses on the postganglionic neuron, and that's going to backtrack through the gray ramus, since it's unmyelinated, and then out the dorsal ramus. Kind of crazy, but that's the way that it is. So preganglionic fiber goes from the, or axon goes from the lateral gray horn, out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve, through the white ramus of the rami communicantes, and synapses at the autonomic ganglion, and then the posterior, or the postganglionic axon, will go from there, out the gray ramus, out the dorsal ramus. Guess what happens if we want to go to the viscera of the front sides and limbs? You got it. Exact same pathway, except for one thing. It's got to go here. And if I were going to go to the front sides of limbs, the preganglionic axon follows the same pathway. It goes from the lateral gray horn, out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve, through the white ramus of the rami communicantes, and synapses at the autonomic ganglion. The postganglionic axon has to backtrack through the gray ramus and then out the ventral ramus to the viscera of the front sides and limbs. So I'm talking things like sweat glands and sebaceous glands and things like that. Got it? So it's a little bit trickier because we have 2 neurons and we always have to stop at this autonomic ganglion first. Because the preganglionic axon is always myelinated, it goes through the white ramus of the rami communicantes. Because the postganglionic axon is usually unmyelinated, it goes through the gray ramus of the rami communicantes. If we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, this first neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. The neurotransmitter at the target, at the end of the pathway, is always adrenaline, norepinephrine, okay, and its cousin epinephrine. So now, There's one more autonomic pathway to go. And I'm going to draw it on this side. I'm going to use this red neuron, but it is going to come out of the visceral motor nucleus because we're talking about control of smooth and skeletal muscle. So now that we know this, we see the preganglionic neuron is myelinated and releases acetylcholine that stops at the autonomic ganglion. The postganglionic fiber continues on from there, usually uses adrenaline, not always, but usually. Then we can follow one of these pathways, okay? I'm not giving you every scenario. I'm giving you the ones that I'm focusing on for my class for now. You may learn some differences in the future. So now look. If I'm going to go to, I don't need to draw all that up there because I'm not going to go back out this way, but they would be here, okay? And that marker is no good. I got to go back to the squeaky one. So, if I'm going to go to the viscera of the thoracic cavity, I got two more pathways to go. So essentially I'm talking about the heart, lungs, and the respiratory passages, the thoracic cavity. The preganglionic neuron starts in the visceral motor nucleus, goes out the ventral root, goes through the spinal nerve. Because it's myelinated, it goes through the white ramus of the rami communicantes, and it's going to synapse at the autonomic ganglion here. The postganglionic fiber is going to go from the autonomic ganglion all the way straight out the autonomic nerve to the thoracic viscera. That's it. Okay? It follows the exact same pathway for the preganglionic neuron and all visceral motor pathways with the exception of the last one. If it goes to the back, it goes from the lateral gray horn out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve, through the white ramus and synapses at the autonomic ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron will backtrack through the gray ramus, out the dorsal ramus if it goes to the posterior wall. It will go out the ventral ramus if it goes to the anterior wall. But if it's going to the actual cavity itself, it's going to go straight out the autonomic nerve. There's no need to backtrack through the other rami. And again, we're going to release acetylcholine here. We're going to release norepinephrine here to increase heart rate, to increase breathing rate, to increase the diameter of the bronchi and the respiratory tract and all of that stuff, okay? So, now the very last pathway that we're going to follow is going to go to the abdominopelvic viscera. So if you think about this, if you remember a few videos back when I talked about sympathetic and parasympathetic, I drew the little choo-choo train. The train represents your brain and skeletal muscle. If they're going 90 miles an hour, you're in fight or flight. Your heart has to start shoveling oxygen and glucose. Remember, your heart is the guy shoveling the coal and the oxygen, or the glucose and the oxygen into the engine so it can go faster, okay? Which means we have to breathe more rapidly, the heart rate is faster and pumps harder. So that's our thoracic viscera. All this gets kicked up in sympathetic. All of the abdominopelvic viscera gets shut down. If you're running for your life, you don't have time to digest, you don't have time to be hungry, you don't have time to urinate or defecate or make waste, you don't have time to think about reproducing. You're going to die. You're in a dire situation. Okay? Now, so under sympathetic, all of the thoracic viscera are going to be excited. All the abdominopelvic viscera are going to be shut off. Okay? Now, or shut down to minimal function. When I switch to parasympathetic, all of this slows down. Respiratory, cardiovascular, and all of this goes into sort of a quiet mode. And all of this ramps up and increases its activity, digestion, waste production, reproductive secretions, and things. So the abdominal pelvic viscera, we tend to think of this as parasympathetic. I'm just going to put parasymp, and I tend to think of this as sympathetic activation. Under sympathetic activation, I want to kick off all the thoracic viscera. I'm going to dump adrenaline on them. Okay? And the preganglionic neuron is actually pretty short. It's right next to the spinal cord where it synapses. And we have this long postganglionic fiber that goes all the way out to these viscera. We use acetylcholine always at the first synapse. And then at the second synapse can be norepinephrine or acetylcholine, depending on if we're sympathetic, parasympathetic. Okay? So now, if I'm going to go to these and do parasympathetic activation, I don't want adrenaline. And it turns out that I'm going to do this in blue. Now follow carefully. The preganglionic neuron is going to start in the visceral motor nucleus, because that's where all visceral motor commands are going to exit from the spinal cord. It's going to send its axon out the ventral root. It's going to send its axon through the white ramus of the rami communicantes. But look, it does not stop at the autonomic ganglion. The ganglion that it's going to stop at and release acetylcholine is in the wall of the organ. Let's say this is our stomach here. It's going to be within the wall of the organ. And then the postganglionic axon can go to several areas controlling the muscle within the wall of the stomach. They're also going to release acetylcholine. If you notice, at every synapse that we've talked about, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. When we went to skeletal muscle, it's acetylcholine. When I go to the autonomic ganglia, it's usually acetylcholine. When I go to all the viscera, it's usually acetylcholine. The only difference is when I get to the targets in the thoracic cavity, it's adrenaline. So this ganglion here under parasympathetic system and in the abdominal pelvic viscera, it is called an intramural ganglion. The ganglion is within the wall of the target organ. So we have a long preganglionic axon and parasympathetic pathway and many short postganglionic axons. And that allows us to have a wide distribution of the effects of this one signal within the viscera, because, you know, your small intestine is 20 to 25 feet long, somewhere around there, around 21 feet long. So I can't have all these axons coming out. I can have one come out, hit a ganglion, and then send a bunch of short axons out within the viscera itself and have all that smooth muscle contracting. So we followed a lot of pathways. The pathways in are pretty straightforward. All sensations coming from the back come in through the dorsal ramus, pass through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root ganglion. The soma lives through the dorsal root. The soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and they synapse in the posterior gray horn. If it comes from sensations from the front sides and limbs, it comes through the ventral ramus. If it's sensations from the ventral body cavity, it comes in through the autonomic nerve and the white ramus. Now, and they all go through the dorsal root, soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion, and they synapse in the posterior gray horn. Motor pathways come out of the somatic motor nucleus, and they go straight out the ventral root through the spinal nerve and straight out to the skeletal muscles of the back, or to the skeletal muscles of the front sides and limbs through the ventral ramus. That's pretty simple. Then you need to draw these two pathways. The visceral motor pathway, that's going to go to the viscera of the back. The neuron goes from the visceral motor nucleus and the lateral gray horn out the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, through the white ramus of the rami communicantes, and synapses at the autonomic ganglion. It will release acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. And then the postganglionic fiber will go out the gray ramus. If it's going to go to viscera of the back, it goes out the dorsal ramus. If it goes to the viscera of the front sides and limbs, it goes out the ventral ramus. And it's always going to release acetylcholine. Well, usually. If I'm going to go to the thoracic viscera, then I have to go from the lateral gray horn, out the ventral root, out the spinal nerve, through the white ramus of the rami communicantes. If I'm going to go to the thoracic viscera, I stop at the autonomic ganglion and release acetylcholine, and then the postganglionic fiber goes out the autonomic nerve to the thoracic viscera and releases adrenaline. That's the only time we use a different neurotransmitter, at least for the pathways that I'm doing now. If I'm going to go to the abdominal pelvic viscera, I have a really long preganglionic axon that goes all the way out the autonomic nerve without stopping. It stops at an intramural ganglion in the walls of the viscera, releases acetylcholine, and then many little postganglionic fibers, which are really short, go within the wall of the viscera and stimulate the muscle and the digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts, using usually acetylcholine. I know that's a lot of stuff. Everything is written in the note set. All the verbiage that I've given you. If you read page 85, it goes over the motor pathways, the somatic, all of the visceral motor pathways, and all the words that I've said are in here. Your worksheets, the ones that I send out, are essentially going to be this with some blanks for you to fill in so that you work your way through it. So there will be a quiz on some of these motor pathways and sensory pathways. There's a few more blank drawings in the note set, and then we get over to the reflexes. So I'm going to stop there. We'll do another video on reflexes. We'll do a video on the last two sections, or two videos, one on each section. We should be wrapping this up. So again, I appreciate all your guys' patience and your willingness to try to work through this. This isn't the easiest stuff in the world, or everybody would be able to do it. But you don't have to be super smart to get this stuff. What you have to do is you have to work harder than everybody else. Remember the race, there's an old, I think it's a biblical quote, or a quote someone told me many years ago. The race does not go to the swiftest, but to those who endure. Or the race doesn't always go to the swiftest, but to those who endure, especially these long marathon-like races. So, again, you guys know that I coach a lot with youth sports, and I always try to tell my athletes and I try to tell my students, you don't have to be the biggest, the fastest, the strongest, the smartest, or the most talented. You have to be willing to outwork everybody else. So, get to work, get this done, push through and work it till you can't stand it, and then do it 3 more times until you understand it. Okay? I hope that you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did. And I hope to see you on the flip side. Let's finish strong, okay, folks? See you soon.